In the shadow of a Dutch philosopher's audacious claims, the world of biblical interpretation was forever altered. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century thinker, dared to question the very foundations of religious orthodoxy. His ideas were so radical that they sent shockwaves through the halls of academia and the pews of churches, challenging centuries of sacred tradition. Spinoza's work, particularly his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, not only blew apart the allegorical interpretations that had dominated biblical study for centuries, but also introduced a new way of reading the Bible, one that treated it as any other book. This video explores the profound impact of Spinoza's ideas on biblical interpretation and the subsequent developments in the field of biblical criticism. Spinoza's approach was revolutionary because it rejected the notion that the Bible should be read through a lens of preconceived beliefs. Instead, he argued that the Bible should be approached with the same critical scrutiny applied to any other text. This meant acknowledging that the Bible, like any other book, could contain errors and inconsistencies. For Spinoza, the goal of biblical interpretation was not to reconcile the text with one's existing beliefs, but to understand its meaning as it was originally intended. This approach was a stark departure from the traditional methods of interpretation, which often involved allegorizing the text to align it with doctrinal teachings. One of the key aspects of Spinoza's method was the rejection of a special hermeneutic for the Bible. In the past, religious scholars had developed elaborate systems of interpretation to ensure that the Bible could be read in a way that confirmed its divine origin and infallibility. Allegorization, for example, allowed interpreters to find deeper, spiritual meanings in the text, even when the literal meaning seemed problematic. Spinoza, however, argued that such methods were intellectually dishonest and prevented readers from engaging with the text on its own terms. Spinoza's ideas were not without their critics. Many religious authorities saw his approach as a direct attack on the authority and inspiration of the Bible. They feared that if the Bible were treated like any other book, it would lose its sacred status and the foundation of Christian faith would crumble. However, Spinoza's influence was undeniable, and his approach laid the groundwork for the development of modern biblical criticism. In the 18th century, the negative aspects of Spinoza's work became more prominent. Rationalist thinkers in Britain and elsewhere began to apply Spinoza's critical methods to the Bible, often with more radical conclusions. Writers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Woolston used these methods to critique the Bible's historical reliability and moral teachings. Paine's The Age of Reason famously challenged the credibility of biblical accounts, arguing that they were filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. Woolston, in his Discourses on the Miracles of Our Savior, went even further, suggesting that the miracles described in the Gospels were allegorical and not meant to be taken literally. These rationalist critiques were seen by many as a direct assault on the foundations of Christian faith. Despite the backlash, the more purely critical side of Spinoza's work continued to develop. One of the most significant figures in this movement was Richard Simon, a French priest who published Critical History of the Old Testament in 1678. Simon used critical methods to question the traditional authorship of biblical books, arguing that many were not written by the figures traditionally credited with them. This was a significant step in the development of what is now known as higher criticism, the study of the origins and authorship of biblical texts. Simon's work was initially seen as a threat by the Catholic Church, which feared that it would undermine the authority of the Bible. However, his methods and conclusions were sound and would go on to influence future generations of biblical scholars. The 19th century saw the blossoming of biblical criticism, particularly in Germany. Scholars like Johann Salomo Semler further developed the distinction between the essential message of the Bible and the historical and literary details. Semler argued that the core of Christian faith was the assurance of God's grace, and that questions of authorship and historical accuracy were secondary. This approach allowed for a more nuanced and critical engagement with the Bible without abandoning the essential tenets of the faith. Semler's work, like Spinoza's, emphasized the importance of separating the eternal truth of the Bible from the specific historical and cultural contexts in which it was written. The development of biblical criticism also included the study of lower criticism, which focused on the textual transmission of the Bible. Scholars like J. A. Bengel and J. Wettstein worked to establish the most accurate versions of the biblical texts by comparing different manuscripts. This work was crucial in understanding the history of the Bible and in resolving discrepancies between different versions. The methods used in lower criticism were similar to those used in the study of other ancient texts, further solidifying the idea that the Bible should be treated as a historical document. The impact of Spinoza's ideas extended beyond the academic realm and into the broader cultural and religious landscape. By treating the Bible as a historical and literary text, Spinoza and his followers opened the door to a more critical and nuanced understanding of religious traditions. This approach allowed for a more honest engagement with the Bible's complexities and contradictions, rather than forcing it into a predetermined framework of belief. However, the legacy of Spinoza's work is not without its challenges. The critical study of the Bible has sometimes been seen as a threat to religious orthodoxy, and many faith communities have struggled to reconcile the findings of biblical criticism with their traditional beliefs. Some have embraced the critical approach, seeing it as a way to deepen their understanding of the Bible and their faith. Others have rejected it, viewing it as a purely secular and anti-religious agenda. In conclusion, Spinoza's ideas about biblical interpretation marked a turning point in the history of religious thought. By treating the Bible as a text to be critically examined, he challenged the traditional methods of interpretation and paved the way for a more honest and nuanced engagement with the Scriptures. The legacy of his work continues to shape the field of biblical studies, influencing how we understand and interpret the Bible today.